The first player that I expect to lose a significant amount of value this season is actually Browns running back Nick Chubb. And to some of you out there, that might seem like a hot take. And this has nothing to do with Chubb, the NFL player, or Nick Chubb, the talent. I'm just trying to read the tea leaves here about what he brings to the table for fantasy and how the running back landscape is going to look next year. As we all know, Chubb is basically a discounted version of Derrick Henry. I mean, he's a pure and supremely talented rusher, but his role is limited to just that, with very little usage in the passing game. In fact, he's averaged under 1.4 receptions per game in all but one season so far, and that's something that I don't expect to change in 2022. Because of his limited receiving work, his fantasy production is largely dependent on big rushing games and touchdowns. You can see just from his fantasy game log last year that while he had 6 games inside the top 10, he had 5 at RB 35 or worse in games where he didn't score and he didn't catch the ball. A perfect example of this is week 4, where Chubb had 22 touches for 105 yards, and that translated to 11.5 PPR points as the RB 27 on the week. Great NFL game, below average fantasy game. Thankfully, though, Chubb is a really good running back, and he's capable of giving you RB1 production every week, and those spike weeks contributed to him finishing as the RB12 last year. But without that receiving work, that's also roughly his ceiling, unless he hulks out and literally has a Derrick Henry type season next year. Looking at his Dynasty price from July ADP, Chubb is the RB12, and we just said the RB12 is roughly his production ceiling on the year, so we're valuing him right around his ceiling. The problem here is there's really almost nowhere to go but down for Chubb's value, and that's going to happen really soon for a couple of reasons. Number one, when January 2023 hits and the fantasy season is over, Dynasty players are going to see the number 27 next to Nick Chubb's name as his current age, and that already is going to scare people. There are currently only 2 players aged 27 or older valued as RB1s right now, Austin Eckler and Derrick Henry, both of whom have produced multiple top 5, even top 3 fantasy seasons, so it makes sense that Dynasty managers are willing to sacrifice age for that elite production. There are other 27-year-olds valued lower as RB2s in Dynasty, guys like Alvin Kamara, Aaron Jones, Ezekiel Elliott, Leonard Fournette, and James Conner. Every single one of these backs have produced better fantasy seasons at least once, if not multiple times, in their careers than anything Nick Chubb has done so far. Yet they're all currently valued as mid to back end RB2s just because of age. Should Chubb drop to their level, that's already nearly 2 rounds of startup value lost as soon as potentially January when Chubb turns 27. The second reason Chubb could lose value, not immediately because of age, but because other players behind him gain value and then bump Nick Chubb down. Looking at ADP again, there are already almost a handful of names that could jump Chubb as early as October once the season gets going, and we're talking about guys like Travis Etienne, Cam Akers, J.K. Dobbins, even Kenneth Walker and A.J. Dillon have a chance. And I think you can easily make arguments that all of those guys jump Chubb this season based on both age and production. Then, after the NFL season, there's the incoming rookies in the 2023 class headlined by Bijan Robinson. And I really wouldn't be surprised if 2 to 3 rookie running backs next year are immediately valued as top 15 assets at the position, so their additions could also cause Chubb to lose value. The reality is it's probably going to be some combination of all of this that forces Nick Chubb's dynasty value down, but the main takeaway is that it's going to go down. This is also assuming that Chubb is still a fantasy RB1 this year, but should anything weird happen that would hurt his production, or he gets hurt and misses a majority of the year, that could cause his value to fall even more than just age and other players producing. Essentially, Nick Chubb is just the hot potato that I do not want to be caught holding at the end of the fantasy season this year. The next player I expect to lose value despite my belief that he will be a good fantasy asset this year is Dolphins receiver Tyreek Hill. As we all know, the situation in Miami is not going to be as fruitful for Hill as it was in Kansas City, and this has already led to a decline in value from a top 5 dynasty receiver in February to a current wide receiver 13 price. There are already a couple of reasons that I believe Hill is going to continue sliding as we head into 2023, and some of them are pretty similar to Nick Chubb. First off, Tyreek is currently 28 years old, which means mathematically he's going to be 29 years old at the beginning of next year. And when dynasty managers see that number 29, the fear is going to set in and he'll naturally fall just from that. We actually have a really good example of this recently in DeAndre Hopkins, who, like Hill, was traded from a prolific situation to a more unknown situation at 28 years old. And despite putting up over 1,400 yards and 6 touchdowns in 2020 as the fantasy wide receiver 4, his dynasty value continued to slide because of his age, and then it's never going to return to his value at where he was when he was traded. That same thing is going to happen to Tyreek, even if he produces an elite fantasy season. Which leads me to my second reason, which is the risk that Tyreek doesn't produce an elite fantasy season this year. And though Hopkins' value fell because of age, it was cushioned by his wide receiver 4 finish in 2020, which allowed him to decline just a little bit more gradually. If Tyreek isn't elite this year and puts up even, let's say, a wide receiver 11 finish, his value will decline because now there isn't elite production to justify a high ADP at age 29. And then let's just say if Tyreek were to finish as a fantasy wide receiver 2, well, I mean, I just don't even want to think about what that's going to do to his value. The final reason is another like Nick Chubb, where players behind Tyreek currently might just play well enough to bump him down. Guys like Deontay Johnson, DJ Moore, Drake London. Maybe we get a Broncos receiver in there, or a Bucks receiver gets back up in there. I don't think it would take much for the community to suddenly devalue Tyreek in favor of younger assets, producing similarly once we're in the 2022 season. The community as a whole is already distrusting of Tua and his talents, and then you add in the unknowns of a brand new first-time head coach in Mike McDaniel, plus the target competition primarily in Jalen Waddle, but also Mike Gesicki and the running backs, and you have yourself a fairly risky situation for Tyreek. I personally am of the belief that Tyreek is still going to be like 85 to 90% of the Tyreek of Kansas City and still be pretty elite. But as I showcased with Hopkins, that would still mean that Tyreek loses value, just maybe not as much next year. If I'm wrong on Tyreek and this Dolphins offense as a whole, then he will for sure lose probably significant value in 2023. Either way, though, his value is dropping. It's just going to be up to you guys to decide how much you think that actually is. Then the final player I expect to lose value is Ravens wide receiver Rashod Bateman. And this hurts because I've been such a Bateman guy since last draft season, but y'all have raised his value so much that now I'm out on him at his current cost. I don't know if y'all are aware, but Bateman is currently wide receiver 19 in July ADP, ahead of both Buccaneers receivers, both Broncos receivers, both Chargers receivers, both Jets receivers, and both Lions receivers. I get that we're excited that Bateman is going to be the wide receiver 1 on the Ravens, but we have already seen what that means for fantasy with Lamar Jackson, and the best it's been was wide receiver 22 on the season. In 3 years as the 100% no questions asked wide receiver 1 for the Ravens, Hollywood Brown has finished as the wide receiver 46, 37, and 22 on target shares of 16%, 24%, and 24%. Bateman is currently the wide receiver 19, and the best Hollywood ever did in Baltimore was wide receiver 22. In fact, Hollywood's highest ADP with the Ravens was 50th overall in 1 QB leagues at wide receiver 24. Again, Bateman is wide receiver 19 at 41st overall. Do you guys see where I'm going with this? The Ravens have shown this entire offseason that they want to return to being a run-first and run-heavy offense like they were in 2019 and 2020. They are not going to throw over 600 times again, and anyone using Hollywood's vacated targets as a reason for Bateman's breakout is simply kidding themselves. If the Ravens dropped to even 500 pass attempts, Bateman's target share would need to be nearly 30% to maintain the raw target numbers that Hollywood got last year, which would have been 3rd in the league last year behind only Cooper Kupp and Devontae Adams. That is not happening. Even a very strong target share at 25% would only be 125 targets on 500 total pass attempts and barely over 110 on 450 attempts. Those target numbers are not getting it done for fantasy unless he either catches 95 or more of those passes or he scores a lot of touchdowns. He could literally be CeeDee Lamb from last year and still finish as the wide receiver 20 in fantasy. Yes, I believe Bateman is a better, more complete receiver than Hollywood Brown, but you can believe that and still think that Bateman is overvalued currently in Dynasty. I think it's telling that Bateman is currently the wide receiver 27 in underdog ADP as a signal of what people are expecting more from him this season. Putting him at wide receiver 19 really minimizes a lot of the upside if Bateman were to produce better than Hollywood Brown. That's the kind of ranking that I would expect if Bateman had already been a wide receiver 2 in the Ravens offense, not just because of hype that he's now the team's wide receiver 1. Not to mention Baltimore is going to be talked about as a destination for a rookie wide receiver all next spring. So Bateman might not even be the for sure team's wide receiver 1 for very long. So capitalize on this value now and turn Bateman into a much more stable receiver for production, or at least a similar age and situation type player that just has way more upside like Jerry Jeudy or Elijah Moore. And speaking of those two players, you can watch this video right up here to learn all about why I love those guys to gain a lot of value this fantasy season.